Okay, Holocaust Memorial Day is Monday 27th of January, and we're keen to play a role in this and highlight what happened, hate crime, how it's prevalent today and how we can help combat it. So I'm delighted to welcome Martin Stern, who is going to tell you a bit about his life story and the lessons that we can learn from it. Okay, so I'm delighted to hand over to you, Martin.
Thank you very much. Right, well, thank you for coming first of all, and as you've heard, my name is Martin Stern. Until 11 years ago I was a doctor. I was treating people in the Leicestershire hospitals, people with asthma, people with nut allergy and drug allergies and food allergies. I was an allergy specialist. But I wasn't always a doctor, I was once a child. And when I was 5 years old, I lived in Amsterdam. It was 1944. It was Nazi-occupied Amsterdam. Okay. I was in a little preschool at age 5, no reading and writing or anything fancy, just games and paper folding and songs and exercises. The form teacher had taken my class into the little school hall. It was only a converted house, it was really very small. She was on a chair behind a table on the little stage. She had lined us up against a side wall ready for some games or something like that. When the door at the back of the hall opened and two young men walked in. And one of them said in a loud voice, "Is Martin Stern here?" And the teacher immediately shot back, "No, he hasn't come in today." And there I was, in the middle of the room. And I didn't understand what was going on. So I put my hand up. And I said, "But I am here." And as these two young men were leading me out of that little hall, I looked back, and I'll never forget the ashen face of the teacher. They took me outside, they had their bikes against the lamppost. It was a grey drizzly day. They put me on the back of one of those bikes, the way people do in Amsterdam, and cycled off with me quite some distance, talking with me all the way. In absolutely perfect, flawless Dutch. These were Dutchmen, these were not Germans who had learned Dutch. And I guess, my guess about their ages, they were about 17. I think they were probably just of military age. We arrived outside a big red brick building. I was marched up some steps into the building, up the stairs to the first floor, made to wait outside a door, not very long, led in to a huge office, in the middle of which there was a large ornate desk, and behind that desk was a rather fat man in a green military-style uniform who started asking me questions. By this stage, I'd got a few questions myself. When can I go back to school? When can I go home? And the man leaned back in his nice chair, raised his arms slightly and protested that he had his instructions, he had his job to do. That was not part of his responsibility. His responsibility was to find out if I was Martin Stern, and if I was the Martin Stern that he was looking for. It was almost as if this man in his imposing uniform behind his big desk was expecting me, a 5-year-old on the other side of the desk, to be sorry for him. And I reckon he knew exactly what he was part of. The green uniform means he was part of the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, part of the same organization as the Gestapo, part of the secret police apparatus of the Nazis, charged in Nazi-occupied Europe with rounding up and deporting Jews, amongst other tasks. As soon as he was satisfied he'd got the right little boy, He ordered another man to take me out into the corridor. Now, that building still exists. I walk past it from time to time because I go and visit an old lady who lives nearby. It's a school. It had been a school. The Nazis just threw everybody out and turned it into an interrogation centre. So I was led into a school corridor, lots of doors off each side, all closed, except for one. And as I was led past this one open door, I could of course see through it, into a smallish classroom. On the far wall was a map, no projectors in those days, printed maps on the wall. And standing there, looking at the map, with his back to me of course, was a man. One man, whom I recognized. I had been living with him and with his young wife for 2 years, near the middle of Amsterdam, round the corner and 3 blocks from the Anne Frank house, over about the same period as Anne Frank. Very different circumstances. I wasn't hidden in a secret annex. They simply pretended I was their son. They took me shopping, they took me to the circus, and I remember them taking me to a play. I wasn't actually physically hidden. I was hidden by the pretense that I was their son and not the son of a Jew. I called out to this man. Normally I'd have run up to him and given him a hug. That's all they wanted. I was not allowed to utter another peep. I was dragged away. They just wanted me, a 5-year-old, to betray the fact that I knew him so well that I could recognize him instantly from behind when I wasn't expecting to see him there. How did things get to that situation? Well, my dad was a Jew. He was born in Berlin in 1911. His dad, my granddad, jointly with somebody else, owned a clothing business that manufactured ladies' coats and ladies' dresses and sold them in the fashionable part of Berlin and exported them all over Europe. They were rich. They lived in an architect-designed villa some distance outside Berlin in a very posh area. They had a house full of antiques. They had educated, cultured neighbours. They themselves were very knowledgeable about classical music. They had paintings on the wall, a painting by Van Gogh, and another one by Matisse, and several others by famous, but not quite so famous as that, painters. My dad, of course, being born in 1911, was too little to be a soldier in the German army in the First World War. But he had an older brother who was a soldier in the German army, and for all I know, he may have shot a relative of one of you during the First World War. I mean, I knew him late in life. He was a very gentle, wonderful person, but he was a soldier, and he did what he could for the Kaiser and for Germany, fighting against the British, the French, and the Americans. And a story I've been told by a childhood friend of my dad's. They played together in the gutter in the street as kids, and this friend, now dead, told me that when this older brother came home from the front on leave, one of the first things he would do would be to take his little kid brother, my dad, into the garden, big garden, and show him how to dig a trench. It was a Jewish family, but they were thoroughly committed Germans. Come Christmas time, they had a Christmas tree. Everybody else had one, and it's so nice for the children. If you were an Orthodox observant Jew, you wouldn't do that. Centuries of discrimination and prejudice against Jews in Germany meant Jews had not been allowed to go to university. All sorts of occupations were barred to Jews. Later on, these things were liberalized, and it was possible for Jews to go to university, but in limited numbers. And although, yes, you could become a lawyer, your chances of actually getting a job were less. So vast numbers of people had converted from Judaism to Christianity over the centuries to get on in life, to be able to earn a living. And that sort of thing, having a Christmas tree in your house, would certainly be sending a message, which would be very unwelcome to observant Orthodox Jewish friends, and would be sending really quite a message. What's more, the older brother was called Wilhelm. Anybody here know anybody else in Germany in the time of the First World War who was called Wilhelm? Does that ring a bell? It was the name of the German emperor, the Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm, nicknamed by the British Kaiser Bill. Now, later on, when the Nazis came to power, one of the top Nazis, a man called Goebbels, his first name was Joseph. Joseph. It's a Jewish name. It's in the Bible. You know, Jewish and the Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat and all that. If a Jewish name was good enough for one of the top Nazis, why couldn't a Jewish family give their son a Jewish name? But instead of that, they chose a very typical German name. They went out of their way to be German. As a matter of fact, my dad was called Rudolph, which isn't only the name of an exceedingly famous reindeer. It's a common, ordinary German boy's or man's name. It's not a Jewish name at all. And the middle name that my grandparents gave to my dad was Bernhard. In English, Bernard. Anybody know where that comes from? Any ideas? Think about dogs in the Alps with casks of brandy around their necks. It's a myth, but Saint Bernard dogs, yes? It's the name of a Christian saint. So here was a Jewish family not behaving in a particularly Jewish way, one has to say. They were trying to fit in. They were trying to be German. My grandfather's brother, as a young man, got a job for a company making a sort of cheap German version of brandy. He was good, he rose to the top, became one of its directors, and he changed its business to become one of Germany's largest manufacturers of industrial alcohol. Alcohol is used in all sorts of manufacturing processes, and it's used as an ingredient for all sorts of products. It's cheap to produce, and he produced it on a large scale. And the firm was becoming international. The problem was, in those days, anybody could just walk into a shop, plonk their money on the counter, and say, "Litre of alcohol, please," and they'd sell him a litre of industrial alcohol, or in other words, vodka. It's drinkable. People did. Germany had been through all sorts of upheavals. It had lost the First World War. Wars are ruinous. They ruin economies. And the First World War ruined the economy of Germany, a prosperous country. Then they were defeated, and they had to sign a peace treaty and the Versailles Treaty, which made matters worse. Germany was in an economic mess, such as we have not seen in recent years. Also, after the First World War, for the first time, Germany got a democratic government in the sense that we would recognize it now. They had had a parliament, they had had elections, but the parliament didn't have full powers. The Kaiser could personally choose and appoint ministers to the government. I mean, just imagine if our Queen tried to do that. It's inconceivable in any modern Western democracy. Germany had had, up to that time, a situation which still exists in many countries in the world today. It's called sometimes authoritarian democracy. It's a kind of hybrid between democracy and authoritarian rule. And they got the full McCoy only after the First World War. Turns out it's not only in places like Iraq that it's difficult to start a democracy when you've not had one before. I mean, it was difficult in Tsarist Russia, wasn't it, and so on. And it was difficult in the heart of Europe, in the country of Beethoven and Brahms, in Germany. A highly developed country with wonderful universities and scientists and philosophers. They made a mess of democracy. There was not the critical pool of people experienced at solving differences by talk rather than by violence. And governments were unstable. They lasted on average for 6 months. They made a lot of stupid decisions, ultimately a decision to print money to get out of debt, which made the money valueless, so that a person who had worked hard at school, got himself a good job, been frugal, saved his money in the bank to provide a safety cushion for his family, would find that his entire savings would not buy half a slice of bread for his family. There were waves of unemployment. The German army, which in the First World War had been huge, and Germany had a tremendous military tradition. They were very proud of their army, and it was a very important part of the culture. They had been forced to demobilize most of that army at the end of the First World War. So vast numbers of soldiers were there unemployed. There was unemployment anyway. They couldn't get jobs. What is more, a year before the end of the First World War, there had been a revolution in Russia, a communist revolution. Now, Karl Marx had not predicted that a communist revolution would happen first in a backward country like Russia. He had predicted that it would happen first in a developed country like Germany, Britain, or France. And there were loads of communists in Germany who believed this and wanted to bring about a communist revolution. There were loads of people in Germany who had seen well enough what had happened in Russia and didn't want any of that in Germany, and who can blame them? And these demobilized soldiers were organized into roaming armed bands called Freikorps, which exerted discipline and order by their own violent methods. There was violence on the streets between the communists and these Freikorps, the demobbed soldiers, organized by and government paid. It was chaos. People were in despair. One of the things people do when they're in despair is drink alcohol. The situation that my grandfather's brother was confronted with, that he saw, was terrible. There was a massive problem with alcoholism. He decided to do something about it. He campaigned to make the sale of his own product cheaply to the public illegal. If you wanted to drink it, you should pay a high tax. If you wanted to clean something, you should buy meths. The situation we take for granted, but it didn't exist. There was lots of opposition. Other alcohol manufacturers were against it. But he campaigned, and he and his group won, and he made a major social contribution to Germany by getting a law introduced to protect people from alcoholism. Well, a fat lot of good it all did. Come the rise of the Nazis, the rise to power in 1933, soon afterwards a fellow walked into my grandfather's business and said, "Get out." Much of the family fled, many to the United States. Is the microphone down by there?
As much as we can do.
Okay, tell me if I need to change to the mic one. But Jews were very much restricted in how much money they could use for tickets and to start a new life abroad. The only person with the foresight to get some money out beforehand was my grandfather's brother, this abandoned alcohol story. But there wasn't enough money outside to get everybody out. My dad got left behind. He was by this time a young, recently qualified architect. He was also fiercely anti-Nazi. There was Jews were not allowed on the street after a certain time of day, I believe 6 o'clock in the evening. Everybody had to carry an identity card. If you were walking on the street, you could have your ID card demanded. If you were a Jew, that marked, that indicated that you were a Jew. And you could then be beaten up, left for dead, dragged off to prison or a concentration camp, or killed. Anything could happen. And my dad went out nevertheless. Being an architect, he got hold of a length of concrete reinforcing wire, which he wore down his trouser leg, so he could defend himself if attacked. Not that he was a big wrestler of a man. I remember my dad, he was thin, he was an intellectual. As a younger man, he had tuberculosis of his lungs. There were no medicines in those days for that. And the treatment was you went to a hospital and you die or you get better. Well, he didn't die. But he would have survived with a lot of damage to his lungs. And if he had to run or fight, he would get out of breath first. So my dad was a brave man. He met a young woman, not Jewish. She was also a recently qualified architect. Also fiercely anti-Nazi. A story I've been told about her by this friend I go and visit in Amsterdam is that she was travelling on a crowded train in Nazi Germany, working her way along the gangway through the crowd with her little suitcase when the catch came through. And the contents of her little suitcase spilled all over the floor. What were the contents? They were anti-Nazi leaflets. And the next person in the crowd was a Nazi Brownship. One of these people who would stop Jews in the street, beat them up, arrest them, whatever. In the normal course, she would have been arrested on the spot, and she would have been lucky to get just a prison sentence. More likely, she would have ended up in a concentration camp. The concentration camps were initially set up for opponents of the Nazis, people exactly like my mom. She was a brave girl. And the story, as I've been told it, she was also a pretty girl, and the brown shirt simply helped her to put the leaflets back in the case. Well, my mum and dad decided they wanted to marry. That, in Nazi Germany, was illegal. The Nazis made a whole set of laws called the Nuremberg laws. They defined who was a Jew. Under the Nazi Nuremberg laws, I count as a Jew. Under the Jewish rules about who is a Jew, I am not a Jew because my mother wasn't Jewish, and it goes according to the mother. The Nuremberg laws prevented Jews from working for the state, local authorities, all sorts of occupations if they were professionals, dentists, lawyers, doctors, or like my dad, an architect, and so on. They could only work for Jews. Jews were between 0.5% and 1% of the German population, so these people instantly were unemployed. The Nuremberg laws defined Jews as subjects of the German state, but as non-citizens. What does that mean? As subjects, they had to obey the laws, they had to pay fines, they had to pay taxes. As non-citizens, they had no rights. When government instigated riots in 1938, caused people to burst into the homes of Jews, smash the place up, steal stuff, drag the people out onto the street and force them to scrub the pavements with their toothbrushes on their hands and knees as they were being kicked, spat at, jeered, laughed at. The police turned up and watched. The Jews had no rights. When the mobs burnt down synagogues all over Germany, over 90 of them, the fire brigade turned up and watched. If the flames threatened neighbouring property belonging to non-Jews, the fire brigade would intervene. Otherwise, they would watch. The Nuremberg laws also forbade marriage or sexual relations between a Jew and a non-Jew. For that, people could be and were sent to concentration camps. My mum and dad wanted to marry. They fled to the Netherlands. The Netherlands, even before they were invaded by the Nazis, seemed to have adopted aspects of the Nuremberg laws. And they were refused permission to marry in the Netherlands, the neutral, tolerant, liberal Netherlands, because the Dutch didn't want to upset their neighbours. My mum had to go and live in Belgium for a while, which entitled her to get married there, and that's when our parents got married. They went back to Holland, and there I was born. The Nazis invaded anyway. They didn't care whether the Dutch thought they were neutral. The Dutch, of course, being nice, peaceful folk, didn't need a big army or lots of anti-aircraft defences and all that, and the Nazis thought they would conquer Holland in 1 or 2 days. When it took them longer, they bombed the centre of Rotterdam flat. The Dutch didn't have a defence. And they sent a note to the Dutch government, surrender in 24 hours or we will do the same to Amsterdam and another big city. The Dutch surrendered. And gradually the same sort of laws were started to be introduced in the Netherlands as had been introduced in Germany. Jews had to go to the local town hall and register the fact that they were Jews. That's all. They had to pay for the privilege. Oh, and by the way, if you didn't, you'd go to a concentration camp. Always, with each new restriction, the restrictions seemed small. And the punishment for not going along with it was absolutely draconian. So now, the Nazis knew where all the Jews lived, except those who hadn't registered, and they could be arrested anyway for not registering. Gradually, bit by bit, the freedoms of Jews in the Netherlands were restricted from having normal freedoms until in the end, most Dutch Jews had one freedom left: to step forward into a gas chamber somewhere. I haven't time to take you through all the stages. The Nazis themselves used the term salami tactics. You know, salami sausage, you take a slice to make a sandwich, and you've still got a sausage. And another slice, you make a salad or whatever. You've still got a sausage. Eventually, a bit of string. And people thought, well, this war won't last forever. We'll go along, we survived before, we'll survive with that. And they allowed themselves, mostly, unless they could hide, to be restricted in this way until it was a doddle for the Nazis to round them up, shove them in a cattle truck, and deport them off to be gassed. When I was 3 years old, my mum stopped me from playing with other kids in the street. It was just too dangerous for everybody to know that there was a little boy living in that flat whose dad was a Jew. And my dad disappeared, and my mum wouldn't tell me where he was. He was hidden on a farm near Amsterdam airport, but she wouldn't tell me that. And then one darkening November evening in 1942, I saw my dad for the last time. He came home from his hiding place. My parents were very agitated. What had happened? My mum had gone into labour. And my dad had risked his life to come out of hiding to help my mum get to the maternity hospital and to get me off to some friends who were going to look after me for a few days whilst my mum was in hospital. And so my baby sister was born. Somebody in the hospital didn't wash their hands. My mum got an infection. It wasn't so rare then. It was called childbed fever. There were no antibiotics. She died. So there was my baby sister with no mother. Dad not in a position to look after her. And the couple that had taken me in for a few days, well, they were stuck with me. Until the day that I saw that man from behind in that building and inadvertently betrayed him. He was sent to a concentration camp in the Netherlands. From there he was transported under terrible conditions into Germany. 20 kilometers from the big port city of Hamburg in Germany is a village. It's a beautiful village. On a bend in the river, weeping willows, lovely cottages. Its name is a nice name. It's Neuengamme. A few hundred yards away from the edge of the village is what remains of a huge concentration camp, where men were worked to death under disgusting, horrific conditions. The food they got was such that in the course of time they would starve to death. Part of the inadequate amount of bread was made of sawdust. They slept in 3-tier bunk beds, 3 to 6 men to a bed with minimal and disgusting bedding, under filthy conditions. You couldn't wash. The food hygiene was terrible, diarrhea and vomiting. 3-tier bunk beds, 3 to 6 men to a bed. I leave it to your imagination. People were beaten and shot. His wife got just his spectacles back. What about my sister? She was taken in by another Dutch family. I haven't time to tell you about that. Dutch police came to the house to arrest my 1-year-old sister. The Nazis had conquered the best part of the Soviet Union. Norway, Denmark, Poland, all the countries down to Greece, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and so on. Wherever they went, they took what they wanted. People in occupied Europe might be starving and homeless, but people in Germany ate quite well until a couple of weeks before the end of the war, because they stole the food and took it to Germany. Dutch people starved to death en masse, but the Germans ate well. They had a huge army and air force and navy. If they wanted nice pictures on the wall, they stole them. If they wanted to drink nice wine, they stole that, and so on. They had everything. But they wanted one thing more. They wanted my 1-year-old baby sister. There's a reflection for you on this then so powerful Nazi Reich that nearly defeated Britain. My sister and I ended up in a prison camp in the Netherlands, barbed wire, wooden watchtowers. First thing I remember being told, don't go anywhere near that barbed wire. The soldiers in those watchtowers will shoot you dead. Creosoted wooden huts, terribly crowded, filthy, inadequate food, vegetables your mum would throw out, and not much of that. And each week, a train of goods trucks and cattle trucks was crammed full with inmates in this terribly overcrowded place. And I would stand there as a 5-year-old watching this happening. I did. And the people loading people in, well, there were a few railwaymen. I can't say they looked that different from the guy who checked my ticket this morning. And there were soldiers, not many. Okay, they were wearing a soldier's uniform, they had a pistol strapped to their hip, but I was standing quite close enough to see their faces, and their faces were perfectly ordinary. And at the age of 5, stupid and ignorant as I was, I betrayed myself, I betrayed the man who looked after me and tried to save me. It was a puzzle to me how a set of normal-looking people could do that to another set of people who I knew were normal. I'd been living amongst them. In fact, they were nice people because they tried everything they could to make life as bearable as they could for the children who were there. And then, before the train slowly pulled out, a soldier with a rifle over his shoulder stepped onto a little step on the end of each truck and held onto a handle put there for the purpose, and as the train slowly pulled out, there was an armed soldier with a rifle on the end of each wooden truck. And I wasn't that stupid and ignorant that I didn't understand what one of those soldiers was liable to do with one of those rifles if one of those unfortunate people crammed inside should manage to scrabble out during the journey. Eventually, my sister and I ended up in a cattle truck, no room to sit, wedged against each other standing, one bucket for a latrine. And it for sure wasn't an express train. I don't know how long the journey took, my memory is fragmentary, but my guess is 3 or 4 days and nights. And I know that wasn't untypical for such a journey. Most such journeys ended in Auschwitz or Sobibor, extermination camps. In Auschwitz, 10% of people were selected for work. You had to look 17 at least, or not more than 40 to be selected for work. At age 5, no chance. So if I had gone to Auschwitz, my life expectancy, when my feet touched the ground on the other side, would have been about 2 hours. The people who were selected for work had an average life expectancy of 3 months. They were worked and starved, beaten and murdered to death. The Germans, the Nazis, referred to it as Vernichtung durch Arbeit, destruction through labour, systematically. If I'd gone to one of those 2 places, I wouldn't be here telling you this. My train was one of few that went to a different place. It was a town, it still exists. It's called Terrazin. It's a walled town. It was built to house the army of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It contained normal buildings, but also barracks buildings around a square for drilling soldiers, 3 floors, balconies facing the central courtyard, and off those balconies, dormitories for soldiers. The Nazis booted everybody out and used it for storing Jews who they temporarily wanted to keep alive. They intended to kill us all, but for propaganda purposes and for bamboozling the Red Cross and for various other purposes, they wanted to keep a few of us alive for the time being. There, my sister and I were taken away from amongst the other children by a woman prisoner. She wasn't Jewish. She had been put in there because she had married a Jew in Amsterdam. She was a simple woman, a primary school education only. Her husband was a market trader, but he was Jewish. And that got her into that place. And she had, for some reason, an urge to look after children, and somebody said to her, there's a train coming tomorrow from the Netherlands. She was Dutch. There are 2 children on that train whose father killed 2 German soldiers. Why don't you look after them? And so she went to one building and fetched me from about maybe 50 little boys. She went to a different building and, of all people, selected my 1-year-old baby sister from amongst a whole lot of little tots and babies. And she looked after us in women's dormitories under terrible conditions. We moved, and wherever she went, she took us with her. It was disgustingly overcrowded. It stank to high heaven. People were dying from a combination of starvation and infectious disease because of the overcrowding, the lack of hygiene. Sewage and water supply systems were not repaired, and the town was crammed with 8 times as many people as it was built for. Disease is guaranteed under those conditions, and particularly the older people died like flies. But the main method of death was that slaves had been used to build a railway line into the streets of the town. Trains of goods trucks and cattle trucks took people off to their deaths in the extermination camps. And so the disgustingly crowded place with fleas and bed bugs and lice became less crowded. First the men went, then the women were invited to join the men. Big argument between the women, should they go? the woman who looked after us, Mrs. de Jong, said, "Don't go, forget it, those men are dead. If you go, you will be dead too." Many of the women, most of the women went to their deaths. Eventually, there was a train for children, and there was an order that all children had to assemble in a certain place to board this train. And I actually remember going to a big children's dormitory, Mrs. de Jong and my, by now probably 2-year-old sister in her arms, and a man with a clipboard comes in, reads out names, the room gradually empties. Eventually, just the 3 of us left in this big dormitory. And she was terrified. If she had somehow failed to hear our names, she was for it. If she so much as dared to touch the door without an order, she was also for it. So we stayed there for hours, with her in great fear. Eventually, very cautiously, she opened the door and crept out. The train had gone. We know about that train. It went to Auschwitz. The children were killed. Why our names were not called out, I do not know. Now, I'm going to have to stop, and I have to make an apology, because normally I go further than this. You see, an American philosopher called George Santayana is often quoted as saying that those who do not learn their history will be compelled to repeat it. Yes, of course, it is essential to learn history. But at the end of the Second World War, people saw what had happened in the extermination camps and said, never again. There have been more than 60 genocidal events around the world since. It's never again, all over again. You see, simply deciding that you know history and you don't want it to happen again doesn't cut the mustard. There is more. The more comes in several dots. One is that it's very easy to imagine that the 20th century was one of the most lethal in human history. In 1904, 1905, the Germans, before the Nazis, had a colony in southwest Africa, which they decided was good farmland for German soldiers. And they decided to kill the Herero and Nama people. And they killed just as many of them as they later killed the Jews. In 1915, the Turks, who had been massacring Christian Armenians repeatedly during the latter part of the 19th century, decided that the Armenians might be disloyal during the First World War and side with their enemies, the Russians. And they decided to do something about it. They killed over 1 million Christian Armenians in what is called the Armenian genocide. And to this day, the Turkish government denies that there was ever such a thing. But it was the second big genocide of the 20th century. And there have been loads since the Second World War. But the further you go back in history, the more violent history gets. And if you go into prehistory and examine the bones of prehistoric human beings, a higher proportion of them have been killed by human violence than in any known historical period, including the Second World War. It turns out that repeated mass violence is a characteristic of us, of the human race. And my interest these days is in what it is about us that makes us do it. But just remember the implication. I say the further you go back, the more violent history gets. The other way of looking at that is the further you go forward, the less violent history gets. We have, despite all the horrors that are still going on today, look at Syria, Libya, Central African Republic, and so on. Despite all that, we've actually been getting better. We've been doing something right. What is it? And there are people who have studied that in great detail, and your teachers will have information about a place where you can look on the internet to get an idea of that. My interest now is what exactly is it about us human beings that makes that happen? And I would argue that each of us, precisely because we are psychologically normal, necessarily have mechanisms in our heads that under certain circumstances make us behave in that kind of way. And I think it's the duty of schools and it's the duty of all of us to learn about ourselves, to behave in a less tribal way. You know, my lot are all right and the rest are unspeakable. If you look at it objectively, it's never like that. You know, in a couple of weeks' time, I'm due to give a talk along with a Muslim survivor of the genocidal killings in the former Yugoslavia. He was born in southeastern Europe, I was born in northwestern Europe. He spoke Bosnian, I spoke Dutch. He's a different generation from me, we've got different religions. The remarkable thing is, he and I have come to astonishingly similar conclusions. And he and I, his name is Kemal Pavanic, have decided to work together to try and put that message across. Now, I've got severe problems with time. What do you want me to do?
Okay, thank you, Martin. Well, we're going to have some time for questions and answers. It is your brunch time. Has anyone got any questions they'd like to ask right now?